Hey guys, I'm Kerry West and welcome back to my photography channel. So I'm thinking we're gonna do a tutorial today, and I know if you've seen my channel you might not think that this is gonna be particularly helpful, but I'm actually taking this one somewhat seriously. This is something that I struggled with a little bit at the beginning because it's confusing. It's just the basics of using a camera basically, and some of this stuff can apply to smartphones as well. As long as you shoot them in manual mode. This video is mostly for my friends who have expressed an interest in learning this stuff. Not that there's anything wrong with the content that's already on YouTube, but I feel like I have maybe a more simplistic way of looking at it, and my hope is for you to watch this video once, maybe twice, and have a pretty firm understanding of the settings on your camera, what they all mean, and how they all relate to one another. So this will be part one of probably at least 2 or 3 parts, starting with the absolute basics. So if you're a noob or if you're just an idiot, then you might want to pay attention because, I'm an idiot and I was able to grasp this stuff, so there's no reason that you shouldn't be able to as well. So let's spank on into it. So we've got a little static scene set up here with my lovely assistant, Mr. Ziltoid the Omniscient. It's kind of supposed to be static. His hair is blowing around a little, but I'm sure you'll forgive me. It's hotter than balls outside, and if I don't have some sort of airflow in here, I'll start sweating and I'll get really angry and I'll just yell at you and make you cry, and that's not my goal today. So anyway, let's look at the back of the camera here. There's a bunch of shit all over the screen, but let's ignore most of it and let's focus on 3 things. Our shutter speed, we've got our aperture, and we've got our ISO. The rest of this shit is completely inconsequential right now. Let's just focus on these 3 things. These 3 things make up the exposure triangle. If you've ever seen a triangle before, it has 3 points. I just learned this like yesterday, so I guess you learn something new every day. They're each represented by their own number. Our shutter speed is represented as a fraction because it's fractions of a second. So right now we're at 1/30, which is 1/30th of a second. That's how long our shutter will stay open when we press the shutter button. The aperture is the middle number, and it is represented in f-stops. I'm sure you've heard that before. The ISO is represented in whole numbers. All 3 of these have their primary function and their secondary functions. The primary function, or the utilitarian function, of all 3 is the same thing, and that is exposure or brightness of the scene. Changing one will either increase or decrease your exposure. Now they each have their own secondary function too, and the way that I like to look at it is they have their utilitarian function and then they have their secondary or creative function. If the creative side wasn't a thing, we would just shoot in auto all the time because the camera does a pretty good job at choosing the right settings to get the right amount of light in your image. But the reason that photographers shoot in manual is for the creative control. It's to utilize these 3 things to get their vision into the photo. So if you were to just shoot in auto all the time, you'd probably have a properly exposed image, but you wouldn't have any creative control over how that image looks. So let's start with aperture, which is this middle number represented in f-stops. Think of this number as string gauges or ear gauges or butt plug gauges. The lower the number, the wider it is. The higher the number, the thinner it is. So using common sense, if it's a lower number, that means it's wider, which means it's letting in more light, so your exposure would increase. So if we go down to f1.4, notice how the scene gets much brighter. If we stop down, which is the term for closing down the aperture, making it more narrow, we're letting in less light. Makes perfect sense, right? So that's its primary function, which is exposure. Works the same with pretty much all 3. And looking at the secondary or creative function of the aperture, it is depth of field, or how much of your scene is in focus. Depth of field is basically just a term to describe the sliver of focus in your image. Everything that falls in front of that sliver is out of focus, and everything that falls behind that sliver is out of focus. So changing your aperture will change how big that slice of focus area is. The wider your aperture, or the brighter your aperture, the less is in focus. So I've still got my subject in focus here, but as you can see behind him, it's much blurrier. As we stop down, it gets darker, but it also brings everything more into focus. So let's take a shot at f1.4. As you can see, it's way too bright. Let's take a shot at f4. It's properly exposed. Let's take a shot at f8. Now it's way too dark. Since you're shooting in manual and you want to have full creative control, it's all about compensation. So say you made the creative choice to have a shallow depth of field. So you're going to open the aperture all the way up to f1.4. But now our scene is way too bright. So we're going to have to compensate using shutter speed. So we're going to have to get a faster shutter speed to compensate for that brighter image. There we go, that's about right. So now we have our shallow depth of field that we wanted, and it's properly exposed. But we had to change our shutter speed to get there. So now say we wanted to have more in focus. We made the creative decision to have more in focus. So we're going to go up to f8 here. But now our scene is way too dark. So now we're going to have to compensate the other way with shutter speed and slow it down until we get the proper exposure again. Now we're at 1/5 of a second. That's all compensating for that aperture hole being shut down even more. You can actually hear how much slower that shutter speed is at 1/5 of a second. And the reason I chose to do aperture on a static scene is because changing our shutter speed to compensate for our aperture values doesn't really matter because nothing's moving. So with that, I'm going to set up a new scene, and we're going to go through the primary and secondary effects of shutter speed as well. Alright, fellers and fellettes. So I set up a new scene here to demonstrate shutter speed. As I said before, this number represents fractions of a second. So right now we're set to 1/50th of a second. Just like with aperture, we can adjust its brightness based on the setting down here. Shutter speed is the setting where we can start tying this in with smartphone usage as well. Unfortunately, to my knowledge, there are no smartphones that allow you to adjust your aperture. It's all fixed aperture. But you can adjust your shutter speed and your ISO. So just like aperture, as we slow this down, our scene will get brighter. As we speed up the shutter speed, so 1/250th of a second, all the way up to 1/500th of a second. Some cameras, can go to 1/4000th, some can go to 1/8000th, some even higher. So let's take a couple shots here. The properly exposed one at 1/50. We'll do a slightly overexposed one just for fun. 1/15th of a second, so that's a much slower shutter speed. It's allowing a lot more light to get through. And then we'll go all the way up to 1/500th, and again, a much darker scene, which is underexposing the image. So that is, just like aperture, that is the primary effect of shutter speed, is exposure. Simple, right? Now for the creative effect of shutter speed, it is going to be motion blur or motion freezing. And that's why I'm using a Newton's Cradle here. So we're gonna go ahead and get these little balls jiggling around, and we're gonna see the effects that different shutter speeds have on this moving scene. There we go, so they're moving now. Let's go ahead and take a shot at 1/50th. As you can see, there's a significant amount of motion blur in my jiggling balls. Let's go ahead and speed up our shutter speed to 1/500. As you can see now, the motion is frozen, but we're still underexposed because we didn't compensate properly. So let's say our creative choice is to freeze any motion in our scene. Again, we're going to compensate by opening our aperture and letting that light back in. So now we have frozen motion and a proper exposure. Now, if our creative choice is to allow motion blur, we're going to go back down to 1/50th for this, and we're going to close our aperture back down to f4. Properly exposed, and we have motion blur. And this is just something that you might kind of have to play with out in the street or in nature or whatever you want to do. Generally speaking, when I'm shooting street, if somebody is just walking, I can usually get away with 1/200 or faster. And I can usually freeze the motion. If they're jogging or running, I might have to go up to 1/500th or even up to 1/1000 to make sure that I don't get any motion blur if I don't want motion blur. So the parallels between a smartphone and a real camera are, generally speaking, a real camera will have a mechanical shutter versus an electronic shutter, or actually real cameras generally these days have both. Your smartphone will have no moving parts. It will actually use the sensor to take the snapshot digitally instead of opening a physical curtain in front of the sensor and letting the light in for a certain amount of time. Way up at 1/8000, it is open for such a short sliver of time, it can freeze just about any motion you want. Or for really cool light trail photos like you see at nighttime, you can open that shutter up for 30 seconds or more, as long as you're compensated enough with the other settings on the camera. But in my opinion, I think shutter speed is probably the setting that can give you the most dramatic shifts between how your image looks, basically. And this is probably something that I've heard a lot, is when people get a new camera and, you know, they get it home and they're excited and they open it and they start taking pictures around their house of their dead cat or whatever, and they look like shit because they're blurry, and they just cannot for the life of them figure out why these images are blurry. Well, 9 times out of 10, I guarantee it's because when you're indoors, your camera is going to compensate in auto mode and use a much slower shutter speed to achieve the proper exposure. And that means when you're indoors, it's a low light situation, it's going to be a much slower shutter speed, and when you're hand holding a camera, you're going to get some shaky motion blur in there. So to go over that again: aperture, main function, exposure. Shutter speed main function is also exposure. The aperture's secondary function is depth of field. The shutter speed's secondary function is motion blur or motion freezing. A lot of this just comes down to practice and understanding these settings and allowing muscle memory to take over once you've internalized what these all do with each other. So now we're going to move on to ISO, and there's a reason I saved this one for last, and it's because it kind of ties the rest of these two together in a sort of glue. So we're going to set up a combination of the last two scenes, and we're going to move on to ISO to tie this all together. Okay, so now we've got a combination of the last two scenes with our shitty cheap Newton's Cradle here in the front and the lovely assistant, Mr. Ziltoid the Omniscient, in the back. ISO is a bit more simplistic. The best way to look at ISO is sort of like a digital volume knob on your sensor, but instead of audio, it controls how much light is getting into your sensor or how sensitive your sensor is to light. It's basically a sensitivity, a gain, or a volume knob for your camera. The higher this number is, the brighter your image. The lower this number is, the darker your image. It's very simple. It works the same as the other two. Its main function is exposure. Its secondary, or I guess you could call it creative function, though it's really more of a nuisance in a lot of cases, is noise, digital noise. Just like turning a volume knob up on a stereo too high, you start to get crackling and it just doesn't sound good anymore. There's too much being pushed through the circuits. That's sort of how this works. As a rule of thumb, most of the time I try to keep my ISO at its lowest setting possible because that will result in the cleanest image. For most cameras, it's a linear progression between your lowest ISO being the cleanest and your highest ISO being the noisiest. When you get a lot of noise in your image, you lose detail, plain and simple. So since I'm trying to keep this number at its lowest, I've got to use the other two to compensate each other, and then I use ISO as sort of a last-ditch effort. So let's go ahead and look at some examples here. We're going to leave the rest of these settings the same. I'm going to put it down to ISO 100, and we're going to take a photo. Now I'm going to crank this all the way up to 10,000. And it's going to be very overexposed, but what I want you to look at is the noise. 10,000 is generally a pretty high ISO, and you're going to see a lot more noise and a lot of loss in detail in this photo. So the reason I said that ISO sort of ties these two together, and I'm hoping you can see where I'm going with this, is that it's sort of a third option in balancing the other two settings. Your main creative goal is generally going to be between your shutter speed and your aperture as far as how you want your image to look. The ISO is going to glue those together in situations where you might get an under or an overexposed image. So let's go ahead and get our Newton's Cradle moving here. Now for this, let's say our creative choice is to have no motion blur, so we're going to go back up to 1/500, and we want Ziltoid in the back to be in focus. See how dark our scene is. Now we raise our ISO. This is generally the only time I want to raise the ISO. Let's take that photo. Now we've got no motion blur, and Ziltoid is more in focus. Now if we want to go the other way, and we want Ziltoid to be very soft, and we want motion blur, we're going to bring this ISO all the way down to about here, And now we've achieved both of those effects. ISO is really the glue that holds these other two together, but it's also the biggest pain when you're trying to just create a clean image. Sometimes you just have to sacrifice a little bit of sharpness in order to get the settings you want otherwise. Alright, so let me apologize by how rushed that last part on ISO was. I probably should have spent more than $6 on a Newton's Cradle. That thing was such a fucking piece of shit that every time I got it going, I'd have to run, and I just didn't have enough time to explain what I was doing and still get a shot with motion in there before it stopped jiggling. So I'm gonna go ahead and pop up those last couple of images on screen, punched into 400% so you can really see the noise. You should get a better idea now of exactly what ISO does. And at the end of the day, it's just a balancing game. It's kind of just a game you gotta play in your head when you're out there shooting. And like I said, it's sort of muscle memory after a certain amount of time. So really it's just, you kind of just get a feel for if you change one setting, another one is probably gonna have to change. Like, you know, something goes up, another thing has to come down, essentially. So my goal for this was really just to sort of get these numbers into your head, and, you know, when you look at the back of your phone in manual mode, or when you look at a camera, you'll see these numbers and you'll be like, oh, okay, this fraction here is shutter speed, and this f-stop is the aperture, and now hopefully you can kind of understand, you know, hey, if I want to freeze this motion that's in front of me, then maybe I should experiment with a high shutter speed first, and then when I get a dark image, I can compensate with the other two settings and see where that exposure lands. And that's really all it is. It's just experimentation, balance, and that game you play in your head that you inevitably just get better at with time. So, but I'm gonna go through a few of my older images, and we'll look at some different styles and different camera settings I used, and I'll explain why I use those settings. So let's go ahead and jump into those, and we'll talk through some of them. Alright, so I don't think these are amazing images or anything. I just think that there's like a good variety of settings used here. So don't call me a big dumb baby bitch or anything. So this one was taken in midday here in Denver, and I chose to expose for the highlights, which basically means I darkened down the whole exposure to make sure the detail was kept in the brightest parts of the image. And I'll often do this, and it crushes the blacks, and I sort of emphasize that in post as well, but most of it was done in camera, where you can see tons of detail still in the highlights. And in this case, if I were to have just let the camera choose, then the shadow detail would have been kept, but a lot of those highlights might have been blown as well, because this is a really high dynamic range scene, which means there's very bright points right next to very dark points. So in order to do that, I closed down the aperture to f11, and I increased the shutter speed to 1/500 to make it a nice dark scene, and that means I had to compensate a little bit by raising the ISO up to 640. The base ISO on this camera is 100, and generally speaking, I try to keep it around there to make for a cleaner image, but I mean, with this camera, the difference between 100 and 640 is basically nothing. And this will be the first example of shutter speed being used here to also freeze the motion. So like I said, when somebody's just walking like this, generally over 1/250th and you're pretty much safe. So 1/500 was a safe bet. So basically I was able to freeze the motion, isolate the subject, and keep detail in the highlights with just these camera settings. So another one in a similar vein, but as you can see, there's quite a bit more shadow detail. I did darken down some of the darker areas in post as well, but as you can see some of the other shadow areas, you can still see detail in it. I shot this one at f1.4. There was an object slightly in front of me, so I wanted that to fall out of focus and give just a little bit of depth to this image. But as you can see, he's running, so I increased my shutter speed to 1/800, and since my aperture was so wide open, shutting down that shutter speed still allowed me to have a low ISO because my aperture was already letting in so much light. I didn't have to compensate using ISO for this one. Alright, so getting a little bit trickier here now. This one was shot at night. So I had my aperture wide open to show depth between the three subjects here. I wanted the last one to be completely out of focus like this, but still obviously be able to tell that it's the shape of a human. But since they were all walking and there was snow falling, I wanted to capture detail in the snowflakes as well, so I increased my shutter speed to 1/400. And since it was nighttime, Even though my aperture was wide open and my shutter speed wasn't super fast, I still had to crank my ISO all the way up to 2500. So in these nighttime situations, you really do have to compensate using ISO, otherwise you're going to end up with motion blur in every single image. Alright, so here's an example of where I actually did want motion blur in this image. I made the creative choice to show motion in the car as it passed by this guy sitting on the median. And since I shot it at a relatively fast but still relatively slow shutter speed, the car was moving so much faster than he was. I mean, he was almost completely stationary. He is pin sharp in the frame, but the car is showing motion blur because I took it just at the right time. If I had slowed that shutter down a lot more, then you might see some motion blur in him as he just kind of wiggles around just sitting there. So since I was at a relatively slow shutter speed, I did have to increase the f-stop number to f5 and close it down just a little bit and keep my ISO at base so it wouldn't blow the image out. Continuing this theme of somewhat more difficult as we go, this one was in midday. My main creative choice for this was to show motion in the water falling from this ceiling. So I shot this at 1/6, so 1/6 of a second was enough time to allow just a little bit of motion blur in those water drops so they weren't completely frozen, so they have these nice lines to them. And since it was daytime, my ISO had to be at its very base minimum, and I had to close down my aperture quite a bit in order to darken the rest of the scene down, because 1/6 in mid-daylight would blow out almost any image if you were trying to shoot it wide open or something. Plus, the added bonus of f8 here allowed a lot more of this water and the ceiling and the spiraling ramp to all be relatively in focus. Now, the eagle-eyed or eared among you might notice that earlier in this video I shot an image at ISO 50. Now technically that is not the base ISO of this camera. The base ISO is 100. Anything below that on this specific camera, which is the Sony A7III, would be an extended range ISO. So it's sort of like a fake ISO. It still takes the photo at ISO 100, but it artificially darkens it down by a full stop just in camera. So technically it's still at ISO 100, just in case you were wondering if there were any inconsistencies there. It's not really something you should worry about at this point if you're watching this video. I just thought I would say that just in case somebody got caught up on that. Alright, so here's the last one, and this one is a bit different than the other ones in that it is mid-daylight. I'm at f11 and my lowest ISO on the camera that I was using at this time, but I shot this at 5 seconds in order to allow motion blur on this train as it passed by me. Now normally in midday, even at f11, I could have even been at f22 and at ISO 200, and I probably would not have been able to achieve 5 seconds without blowing the image out. So, and this is probably something I'll get into on a little bit of a further deep dive onto the next video, but I used an ND filter for this, which is basically like sunglasses for your camera. So it's able to cut the amount of light coming in general, so it's almost like you're shooting at night, so you're able to get these really long shutter speeds during the day. But as I said, I'll probably deep dive into the technical aspects of all these different things that make up the exposure triangle in a future video, so stay tuned for that. But anyway, I hope you guys enjoyed. I know this is a little bit different than my usual content. It's not quite as horrifyingly stupid, but I'm sure that we'll continue doing that at some point. But I did enjoy doing this, so I might keep making videos like this at some point. So yeah, I hope you enjoyed. Please like and subscribe if it helped you at all, or maybe share it with any dumb friends you have, or just friends that are trying to get into this sort of stuff. And I'll see you guys in the next one.